I'm so honored to be today here with you. It's a privilege for me. Thank you, the organizers, for giving me this opportunity. And we are going to talk about perspectives of peace, right? It's been already almost 2 years since this war in Ukraine has started. And unfortunately, it continues to claim people's lives, to destroy Ukraine economy, and to drain Western resources. Why not? And it's time to think about peace and how can we achieve peace there. So let's try and find out some answers. And for this, let me welcome on stage with me, as the stage is ready soon, my distinguished guests this morning. It's Rachel Epstein, Senior Associate Dean at Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, United States. Peter Ruff, Senior Fellow and Director of Center on Europe and Eurasia at Hudson Institute. And Karl-Heinz Kamp, former president at the Federal Academy for Security Policy in Germany. Good morning, welcome. But before we start our conversation, let me introduce you His Excellency, the Mr. Ihor Prokopchuk, the Ambassador of Ukraine to Romania. Good morning, Your Excellency. You can have your opening speech.
Excellencies, distinguished participants of the forum, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored to have the floor at the first working session of the 12th edition of the Aspen GMF Bucharest Forum. I sincerely thank the organizers for placing the spotlight of this year's forum onto multiple aspects and consequences of the war of aggression which Russia continues to wage against my country, Ukraine. I trust the debates that will follow within the next 2 days will produce important insights and ideas that will help us tackle different challenges more effectively. The title and focus of the current session, Perspectives for Peace, is of crucial significance for my country, the region, Europe, and the world. And I appreciated that this session is joined by such distinguished panelists from both sides of the Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky repeatedly emphasized, there is no other country or international actor that wants peace more than Ukraine does. Ukraine did not want this war. It was treacherously attacked, becoming a victim of unprovoked aggression. Today marks the 624th day of the full-scale war of Russia against independent and sovereign Ukrainian state. The war of genocidal nature. The period of challenges and hardships in the extreme, as Ukrainians have encountered inhumane brutality and atrocities. Tens of thousands of killed and wounded, over 10 million displaced persons, destroyed cities and villages, deliberate shelling of civilian infrastructure and residential areas, blackouts and terrible ecological disasters, forcibly deported Ukrainian women and children. As was correctly put before, based on facts of Russian invasion, if Ukraine stops fighting, it will disappear. If Russia stops fighting and pulls back, the war will end. So far, the Russian regime has not displayed a change of its original strategic objective of destroying Ukraine. It is also clear that the Russian regime has expansionist ambitions stretching further into Europe beyond Ukraine. It is in such environment that President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has presented his tailored and structured vision for peace, the peace formula, a comprehensive 10-point plan to ensure just, stable, and lasting peace. President Zelensky proposed the peace formula at the G20 summit in Indonesia in November last year. since then ever larger number of countries that respect the cornerstone principles of independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty of states have been joining that initiative. Let me recall that earlier this year in February, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the resolutions titled Principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. It was supported by 141 nations from all parts of the globe. Provisions of that resolution captured the points of Ukraine's peace formula, in particular restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, withdrawal of Russian troops, restoration of justice, preventing escalation and repetition of aggression. The peace formula is of a universal character and is about preventing such wars in the future. As we look at the perspectives for peace, it is essential to, first, fully rally around Ukraine's plan for peace, and second, make systematic and robust steps towards its implementation. A number of practical measures related to the peace formula were discussed recently at the third meeting of National Security and Foreign Policy Advisors that took place in Malta. Representatives of 66 countries and international organizations took part. Distinguished participants, while we aspire for a just and lasting peace, this peace must be won in the ongoing fierce battles. To win it, it is crucially important to achieve, first and foremost, a radical increase in the capabilities of the defense forces of Ukraine. It is necessary to procure the necessary weapons, including air defense systems and fighter jets, heavy weaponry and ammunition. Hardware and ammunition must arrive to Ukraine as soon as possible. Second, the sanctions against Russia must be implemented 100% and be further stepped up. Notably, restriction measures are needed against the Russian nuclear sector. Third, Ukraine's rapid progress to achieving full-fledged membership in the European Union and NATO. Despite the ongoing war, Ukraine has made unprecedented steps in reforms and implementing all recommendations provided by the European Commission. We welcome the historic recommendation of the European Commission presented yesterday about opening the accession negotiations with Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova. It is a real recognition of the determination of Ukraine to succeed on the path of European integration and achieve the full membership. We also do expect that the long-awaited decision with regard to Ukraine's membership in NATO will be adopted at the upcoming Washington NATO summit in 2024. Ukraine's membership in NATO will be an asset to the Euro-Atlantic security, and Ukraine is able to make a decisive contribution to safeguarding peace, security in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine is fighting to defend freedom, democracy and values of Europe. As we contemplate perspectives for peace, it remains absolutely necessary to stand firmly with Ukraine and help it defeat the Russian aggression to prevent its further expansion to other parts of Europe. Before concluding, I would like to reiterate our gratitude to all allies and friends for their support. I would like to particularly express an appreciation to Romania and the Romanian people. We highly value the assurances on high political level and among the public and business circles that Romania will stay with Ukraine as long as it is necessary until the full victory. We also appreciate that such stance is taken by the international community in support of Ukraine. I would stop here and pass the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Please join us. And before we start our conversation, I will just have a couple of announcements to make. You will have the opportunity to ask some questions towards the end of the conversation. There's a microphone right there to the left. So 5 or 10 minutes before ending this session, you can get up there and just ask your question. And also, I would kindly ask people in the background to keep it a little bit more quiet, as the echo of this fabulous building is amplifying all the noises. Thank you so much. And now, we'll go straight to the subject, and probably that's the most difficult question to ask now. How close are we to achieving peace in Ukraine? Rachel Epstein. Oh, there's a microphone here. Hopefully they're on. Yeah, it's on.
Thank you so much for the question, and I'm also really honored to be here from the University of Denver. We are not very close to achieving peace in Ukraine. I think, as the ambassador referred to, the value of this meeting and so many other gatherings involving a transatlantic audience is to think through not only strategically how we get to a peaceful resolution to this conflict along the lines that you explained so eloquently, but then also thinking about the future. What is the West's relationship with Russia? What does Russia look like at the end of this conflict? And then I think very importantly on the issue of institutional membership for Ukraine in NATO and the EU, those are both very achievable and I think very constructive paths forward. What we know from research is that those overlapping memberships between the EU and NATO really have done enormous good in terms of fostering democracy, stability, peace, and prosperity for the countries that are brought into those organizations. So in terms of how I think about securing peace in the long term, that pathway is critically important. And I would say also in the context of Ukraine coming into those organizations, there's a process that we've embarked on many times before. And I was here in the early 2000s researching Romanian accession to NATO at that time. And what's critical and what I want to emphasize is the values, the core values that countries in the transatlantic community share, and that as Ukraine's continuing social transformation in the context of the war unfolds, that we really take the opportunity to grab the values, the democratic values particularly, that we have in common, and build a bond that is going to sustain peace going forward. I think that's critical in the international institutions, aside from the technical side of enlargement of these organizations, to really foreground the values that are at stake.
Peter Ruff.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks to the Aspen Institute and the German Marshall Fund, to Mircea Joana, and to Heather Conley for their gracious invitation. I would just start with the observation that it's an empirical truism that most major interstate conflicts end either in victory or defeat. We shouldn't delude ourselves to thinking that some sort of clever, artful diplomatic intervention will necessarily pacify this conflict. In fact, a great example of this is the recent experience in Karabakh. There were many mechanisms and formats over many decades between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and in the end, that conflict was resolved when the Azerbaijanis moved into Karabakh and took back that province as their own. So as I see it, it's premature for a variety of reasons that we should pressure the Ukrainians into some sort of negotiated off-ramp. It's true that there is, to adopt a phrase from the Middle East, or Syria in particular, a vital Ukraine of sorts. By defending Kyiv heroically early in the war, there is a national government that's commanding a military rather than an exiled political apparatus running an insurgency. And by defending the approaches to Odessa in the south early in the war, Ukraine ensured that it continues to have some access through the Black Sea to the outside world for its commodity export-based economy. Both of those, I think, are essential for Ukraine to be viable and not a landlocked country wholly dependent on Western aid heading into the future. But I don't think it's sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient, to use a trite phrase that's probably invoked all too often, but nonetheless true here, that Ukraine be given an opportunity. They've run multiple counteroffensives, and while everyone's focused on this counteroffensive and a famous interview in The Economist and perhaps a counteroffensive that's culminated, the fact of the matter is that there was a stunning success in Kharkiv last year. Kherson was liberated about 1 year ago, almost to the day that we're meeting here in Bucharest. And the Ukrainians, if they have the will and the desire to fight, which they do, and merely need support from the West, which is a pittance of our national wealth coming from the United States and the monies that we've supplied, and no Americans are fighting and shedding their blood in Ukraine. I think it's a worthy cause to support, and we should give the Ukrainians more time. And the ambassador has already laid out in his opening remarks some of the areas in which Western support is essential, in particular on the weapons systems. Perhaps one last comment on the journey to peace, and my colleagues already laid out some of the institutional advantages to EU and NATO partnership. But one common, I don't want to call it a rhetorical trope, but analysis that's seeping into American politics is that the US should supply weapons, but on some of the other assistance programs, we should consider pulling back. And there seems to be a consensus forming in that direction. We saw it also last night in the presidential debate on the Republican side in the United States. I think we shouldn't forget that Ukraine can win the battles but lose the war if its society collapses. They require a whole of society, whole of government effort to take on this much larger and formidable force in Russia. And the day that deterrence failed in Ukraine, it became incumbent, I think, upon us for our own security, as Mircea Joanna pointed out, to ensure that Ukraine has both the economic means to stay in the fight and also the military equipment needed to take the battle to the Russians.
Yeah, and we'll be talking shortly about how much longer can the Western countries support this war in Ukraine, or Ukraine in this war. Karl-Heinz Kamp, sir, what do you think? Are we close to achieving peace, or rather not?
Well, first I can, does it work? I can just only echo what has been said before. The war will end when someone explains to Mr. Putin that Russia has long lost the war. Russia cannot achieve its strategic goals, whatever the strategic goals were. So when we talk about perspectives for peace, it's about the time after the war. And there, certainly NATO membership has a crucial role. And let me go back for a second to 2008, when we had the discussion on NATO membership in this city. And since I was German, I was at the summit at that time. It is now today said that Merkel prevented Ukrainian NATO membership. At that time, in 2008, there were 8 NATO countries opposing Ukrainian NATO membership for 3 reasons, basically. First reason, not to alienate Russia, because at that time, whether we like it or not, Russia was still regarded as a partner. Second reason, because Ukraine did not seem ready at this time. All the public polls in Ukraine showed that Ukrainians were against NATO. And the third argument, often forgotten, was that taking Ukraine into NATO means defending Ukraine militarily at its eastern border. Today, from these 3 reasons, 2 reasons don't count anymore. Russia is not a partner, Russia is a threat. And Ukraine is, of course, ready for NATO because they are fighting, they are dying for our Western values. But the third argument is still there, which means taking Ukraine into NATO means defending Ukraine at its eastern border. Does this prevent Ukraine membership? Not at all. But we have to be aware, NATO has to be aware that this comes with a price tag. We are currently struggling, NATO is struggling to defend Polish eastern border, Baltic eastern border. And the Polish eastern border, the Ukrainian eastern border is 1,200 kilometers away. So yes, NATO membership for Ukraine, but it comes with cost, and this is why particularly the US is currently still hesitant on this decision, but I'm personally convinced that until next summit in Washington, we will have an important step in that direction.
Your Excellency, what do you think about achieving peace any soon now? I think it's on. You just have to.
Well, I try to outline our vision of the path for peace, and actually this is all built around this initiative of the Ukrainian president. But so far we are in very fierce battles, and there is a war that needs to be won. So basically, when we speak about peace, it is what I have to say that we need to arm the Ukrainian forces as quickly as possible and to procure weapons that are necessary for the Ukrainian army to win the battles on the battleground. This is fundamental for achieving peace in Ukraine. So once again, I would emphasize the point relating to Ukrainian armed forces, military forces, the military supplies that must arrive to Ukraine as soon as possible. And basically, until now, we're now, as I mentioned, it's over 600 days of war, we're still facing a force that is superior to Ukrainian army in terms of numbers and in terms of hardware, weaponry. And still, Ukrainian forces are fighting successfully this force, which was preparing to take on the entire NATO. And this is a remarkable achievement of the Ukrainian army and of the Ukrainian people. What is needed is basically to give more to Ukraine to at least gain a parity in terms of technological edge, where again we are lacking now, and also in terms of the numbers of weapons and ammunition that are needed on the battleground. This is of paramount significance.
But still, at least we agreed on one thing, that the peace is not quite close, and we still have a lot of work to do to get there. But in order to achieve peace, of course, there's the need of a compromise of the parties involved. What would be the necessary compromise in order to get there, to get the peace?
Between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
I don't actually favor a compromise in this case for all of the reasons that the ambassador has already laid out. I also agree with the ambassador that the supply of arms to Ukraine has been too slow. And I think at the beginning of the conflict it was explicable because from a Western point of view, from a US point of view, there was fear of escalation. There was also fear about a nuclear conflagration. But for all kinds of reasons that we've learned in the meantime, the likelihood of nuclear use in this instance is not very likely, fortunately, and it's harder for me to justify the slowness and the inadequacy of the armaments provision to Ukraine at this point. So I'm actually not a person who would argue that the Ukrainians should be put in a position of having to compromise or give up a lot. I think one of the greatest achievements of the post-war order is that large countries don't negotiate the fates of smaller countries. It's up to Ukraine when Ukraine decides that it's ready to negotiate for peace and under what terms, and I think that Ukraine's allies should support it in its endeavor to do so.
But then how can you get the parties at the negotiation tables without any compromise?
Well, I wouldn't frame it as compromise. I would say what pressure needs to be applied on the Russians for a productive negotiation to take place. No one is marching on Moscow, well, except for Yevgeny Prigozhin, who marched on Moscow, but no one is planning to march on Moscow, which is to say, at some point there will be a negotiation, most likely with Vladimir Putin. But I think part of the theory of the case behind the American strategy and the Western European strategy, or the West, let's just put it that way, writ large, has been to back the Ukrainians so that they can get into a negotiation with the Russians at some point. Where I think the U.S. has made a mistake, and this builds off of the previous remarks, is we had to come in much bigger, much earlier. And the incremental, tepid and slow, cautious approach to delivering weapons to the Ukrainians for fears of escalation was a complete misreading of the situation, just as we misread what the opening dynamic in the war would be, offering to exfiltrate President Zelensky out of Ukraine. Had we gone in bigger earlier and not allowed the Russian engineering corps, for example, to fortify the south, who knows where this most recent counteroffensive might have ended up. But the point being, it's up to the Ukrainians to define and set out what exactly the war aims are. The West should support it, and I think our strategy to date has been a sound policy, perhaps, of trying to empower the Ukrainians to get to a negotiation, but the strategy to get there has not matched, which is to say we've under-resourced it and been too slow and tepid in getting the Ukrainians what they require. And perhaps one last quick point on the NATO comment. I agree that there are additional responsibilities incumbent on the West should Ukraine come into NATO for the defense then of Ukraine. But just as the NATO and the West struggles to defend parts of, say, the Polish border, border. The Russians are struggling to take even towns like Bakhmut. So I wouldn't underestimate the value and strength and quality that the Ukrainian armed forces bring to NATO. And one of the early jokes in the war, in the early months, making its way around Washington and probably other capitals, was Ukraine doesn't need to join NATO. NATO should join Ukraine, given that it's probably one of the most, they're going to exit this war as one of the most formidable armies in the entire alliance.
Of course, in this war, each party has had significant losses. How much can they take? How much can they support more before they get together for talks?
Well, it depends on how you regard the relevance of human lives. And apparently Russia does not regard the value of human lives very high. That's why they send thousands of young people in the meat grinder and let them die. This is terrible to see. And this is why this is a factor which would be important for us, for our countries, but apparently against all hopes of Putin are still supporting Ukraine. He was expecting that this entire thing is going to collapse in a couple of days. It does not. And even a country like Germany, often criticized for not doing enough, we had this Zeitenwende from the embarrassing offer of 5,000 helmets at the beginning of the war, now to be the second largest supporter of Ukraine. And if I would be Putin, I would see, my goodness, this is going to go on. So if he would act rationally, he would think about compromises. Apparently he does not, so we have to wait, as I said, until someone explains Putin that Russia has long lost the war.
So, Ambassador, is there any compromise on the table, at least, or you exclude everything?
I think there is a very broad consensus among this coalition of countries that support Ukraine, that Ukraine is fighting not only for its own independence, it fights for democracy and it fights for the ideas of freedom. So democracy and freedom. Can we compromise on the notion of freedom for Ukraine, for this country, for other European nations? The countries of Central Europe, they lived for decades being dominated by the Soviet Union and facing dictatorships. Are they willing to, any of them, to contemplate a compromise on freedom? Ukraine has gained also its freedom just a few decades ago, and this is a very precious price for my people. I don't think there is any readiness at all to compromise on it. And second, there is also a very broad consensus that Russia flagrantly violated very basic principles of international law, like the sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolability of international frontiers. Is there any appetite to have compromise on the principle of inviolability of international frontiers and the use of force by one country against the other to grab part of the territory of this country? I don't think so. And therefore, Ukraine now, I don't think there is any room at all to take a transactional approach to resolving the war started by Russia. It must be a very principle-based approach which would be rooted in the basic principles and norms of international law. And this is what we are all united to defend. And as Madam President of the GMF, Madam Conley, mentioned, the preamble to the Washington Treaty, as she made her keynote remarks, this preamble speaks about the countries uniting to defend the heritage of European civilization and also the shared values. And this is exactly what Ukraine is doing now by fighting this war started by Russia. I don't think there is a room for compromise here. Russia must withdraw from the Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine must be able to fully restore the sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders.
Is there any way to convince Russia to withdraw from the occupied territory other than by fighting?
I don't think that sweetmeats and delectables are going to convince Vladimir Putin. It probably has to be the application of force. His intentions are obvious and clear. There's no debating anymore. He's torn up the NATO-Russia Founding Act. He's invaded another country. He's saber-rattled at the West, including all the way up to the nuclear threshold and without use beyond. I mean, he's inverted the nuclear paradigm now by generally we've considered nuclear weapons to be a defensive weapon. It's now being used for offensive coercion. And I would just add, you know, the proliferation incentives to add to the other kind of principled reasons for supporting Ukraine are there as well. Ukraine famously gave up at Budapest its nuclear weapons stockpile in return for loose guarantees for a future in an open and free Europe. Loose guarantees now are not going to be sufficient. The Americans aren't willing to give a unilateral security guarantee either, given that our entire debate in the West has been about burden sharing over recent years. Why would the Senate in the United States ratify a unilateral security commitment without our European partners on board, which is why I think NATO is the natural vehicle for Ukraine. So I think coercion, application of force, and supporting the Ukrainians. And just because I'm an American, if I can make one comment about war fatigue in the United States, because I think it's on everybody's mind, I actually have a somewhat optimistic read on this. I'm cautiously optimistic that the package now being debated in the Congress will pass. It's a big number, which I think is appropriate because we don't want to go through this again based on burn rates in the spring. So to get through the American presidential election cycle. And I actually think polling is not as negative as some make it out to be. We're a very polarized country right now, yet 40% or 45% of Republicans support a package and a policy that is closely identified with Joe Biden. Give me any other issue, tax policy, immigration policy, where 40 to 45% of Republicans are with the opposing party's president. And Democrats, I think, because of Joe Biden, are in support of the policy as well. So I think we have a big package that's likely to pass, although we don't know for sure, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it will send a signal to the Russians that we're in it for the remainder of the Biden presidency, if not beyond. And I actually think there's more bipartisan support here than people realize. And on foreign policy, Americans and the American public need to be led. I think it's just a fact that foreign policy tends to be an elite-driven exercise, and the presidential bully pulpit matters a lot here. So if we have solid leadership from the top, making the argument for why Ukraine is important, as the ambassador did here today, and as my colleagues have, I'm confident that the American people will support the Ukrainians into the future.
So, is there any chance to start any peace talks as from the current situation, since Russia cannot be convinced or forced to withdraw from the occupied territories?
I don't see that opening right now. I would love to hear what the ambassador thinks is the answer to that question, but no, I don't see an opening, and I think that my colleague is correct that the appropriate way forward is to follow Ukraine's lead in terms of having Ukraine being able to establish the conditions under which it's willing to negotiate with Russia. So I think probably additional military pressure, and I think the outline of the US position on arming Ukraine in the long term is incredibly important for sending the signal to Russia that the West is not going to give up on this conflict or give up on Ukraine. I'm perhaps less optimistic than Peter is about what happens following the 2024 election. I think you're right about public support being available for leaders who are willing to marshal it, but I also worry about certain elements, particularly in the Republican Party, if they come to power, particularly somebody from the Trump faction of the Republican Party, given the way Trump conducted himself vis-a-vis the alliance in his first administration. So there are, I think, some dangerous elements in American political scene that we need to be watching out for, and I, for one, will be looking for all legal democratic ways to make sure that Donald Trump does not assume office again, not least because of what's at stake in Ukraine and Europe and for the alliance, but also for American politics.
How dramatic would that change the entire situation?
Oh, I think it would be very dramatic. I mean, there is a possibility that once someone, despite their very extreme rhetoric in the run-up to the election, sometimes we see people like that assume office and the office moderates their conduct and their rhetoric. But Donald Trump is not somebody who's shown any inclination for moderation. And in fact, the longer his public profile exists, the more extreme and unhinged he seems to become. So on a whole array of issues, domestic and international, if he or someone like him, I think, were to occupy the presidency, we would be in deep trouble.
Sir, speaking of support, how much longer the Western partners would be able to still be with Ukraine in this war?
Well, ask it from the other way
Especially since next year we're going to have elections all over Europe.
Yeah, wait a minute. I mean, first, the starting of the war was based on wrong assumptions on the Russian side, believing that Ukraine would not defend itself and the West would not support. And the winter gets cold and we don't have gas and the entire thing collapses. If you would ask anyone in this room 1.5 or 19 months ago how long Western support would go, I think hardly anyone would have said it would have gone for 624 days. So, once again, being Putin, I would say, my goodness, all my assumptions did not work. And from all I hear from the German government, from the US government, from all NATO, EU, G7 countries, there is the statement of we will support as long as it takes. That individual elections in countries can change things. True, US is certainly the most important one, but still this can still not be taken for granted. And even if, until the US election, it is still a year to go. So whether Russia is able and willing, because you are asking about the rates of casualties, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of Russian young men and women dead or more or less taken out of the battle. How long this regime can sustain this, I don't know. It's a tragedy. Apparently, the leadership doesn't give anything for this. But the drain for Russia, Putin is ruining his own country. And this is the tragedy of all this behind.
Please, go ahead. You wanted to add something.
Well, I would just say, I think Putin still believes his assumptions were correct. It's just that the timelines are now extended. And so he's still banking on a collapse in the West. And I don't think that we can ignore, for example, reports over the weekend that the Americans at the most recent meeting of the Defense Contact Group are floating potential off-ramp negotiations in the near future. So even if Donald Trump were to win the presidency, who's to say what state the conflict would be in if he were to inherit it?
Your Excellency, is Ukraine afraid that is losing the support of its Western partners, especially since the focus lately shifted a little bit towards the new war in the Middle East?
Well, we have been recognizing for decades that this is a very, very complex security environment that we have around us, and therefore the collective West must be prepared to deal with multiple conflicts and multiple challenges. So while we see that there is a certain shift of attention to the developments in the Middle East, we don't feel that there is a threat of diminished support to Ukraine. Just as it was said, on the highest political levels, we do receive the reassurances that our partners will stand with Ukraine as long as it is necessary. So these are very clear messages that we receive from Europe, from the United States, and from other of our allies. We believe that this will stay because, again, there are very fundamental goals and very fundamental values that we all share. It cannot change just because of an election cycle. These are the values that have been embedded into the collective West conscience, and we do trust that there will be a strong will to defend them.
Okay, as we still have a few minutes left from our conversation, if there are any questions, we would be happy to take them now. So the microphone is right there on the left. Please just get there and introduce yourself. Until then, from a military point of view, is Ukraine still able to free up more territories as the operations seem to have stalled lately? What do you think?
Well, I'll just say, I think we have to have some strategic patience here. We were bottled up in Normandy when we landed, in World War II. We've seen, I feel like in the era of social media, if the Battle of the Bulge were going on, to continue the World War II theme, there would be people calling for immediate ceasefire negotiations with the Germans. There are constraints on Ukraine, manpower constraints, weapons constraints, et cetera, for sure. It's tougher and tougher to recruit. Those reports from the ground seem to be true. But look, there are also restraints on the Russian side. There are political constraints to widespread mobilization and brain drain problems that Putin has as well. So it's tough on the Ukrainians. It's getting hard. I don't need to speak for the Ukrainians with the Ukrainian ambassador here. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians continue to signal, President Zelensky on down, that they believe this fight is existential. If they are watching their women being raped, their apartment buildings being rocketed, their children being abducted, I can't imagine that even if it's brutally difficult to stay in the fight, they want to stay in the fight, because what is the alternative? So I think getting beyond the tactical back and forth, the reading of, how's this counteroffensive pincer movement or maneuver versus attritional battle going, the general political will is still there, even if it now with the weather means that that we're entering a new phase of military operations, and even as kind of the spectacular attacks, for example, in the Black Sea continue, and then in the spring, there might be a new dynamic in play.
Sir, what do you think?
We have one disadvantage from the Ukrainian point of view, and this is the fact that there is concern among Western leaders about escalation, about nuclear escalation from Russia. As unlikely this might be, as stupid it might be from the Russian point of view, Putin did already stupid things, so he might do it again. And this, whether we like it or not, influences the calculus on what kind of weapon can we deliver. And this is why we have the discussion now on the Taurus system, which goes 500 kilometers, which would be a tool to do much more with regard to liberating the Crimea. But there is a concern in Germany, in the US, by the way, on this escalation thing. As I said, we might not like it, but it's something that determines the risk calculus of many Western leaders, and this also determines the question of which weapons can be delivered at what time.
As we don't have too much time, I would just ask you, what should be the lessons of this war?
Well, I think greater preparedness at the outset would have been very desirable. I think reading the signals from the 2008 war in Georgia following the Bucharest Declaration, I, in retrospect, believe a lot of the NATO repositioning towards out-of-area operations, towards the Middle East, towards Central Asia. I mean, of course, everybody on the panel is correct. There's been a major reorientation of NATO in the meantime. But I will say from my research in the 1990s, I think the Americans in particular were extremely naive in comparison to people in this part of the world about Russia's trajectory and the possibilities for an enduring partnership with Russia. I think the Americans in particular, I would say, didn't hedge carefully enough. We weren't prepared enough then in the 2000s for a conflict of this kind. And so, when I think about what can we do going forward to prevent another such conflict, I think it's really to double down on the values and the military preparedness and the democratic consolidation in the countries about which we're speaking in order to really reinforce the community from both the political and military point of view.
It's a hard power world. Your defense industrial base still matters. Quantity matters. Number two, Iran is an enemy, not a friend. Stop empowering the Iranians, whose drones and potentially future missiles are raining via Russia down on Ukrainian cities, and also have empowered Hamas to attack Israel. And then number three, avoid strategic dependencies on potential adversaries like Russia or in the future, China. Those would be three big ones for me.
One last word, please.
Well, let me conclude with a positive note. My lesson learned is that this idea of the West, this combination of democracy, market economy, and freedom is not dead. It is pretty much alive and kicking, and this might be the biggest disappointment for Xi Jinping and for Putin and for some others.
Ambassador, your last word.
I think the lesson of this war is indeed it proves that we are living through the inflection point that will be defining how the events will unfold in Europe and in other parts of the world in this century. So I fully agree with the point that was made before about the need for boldness in terms of decisions to be taken. And this relates to support of Ukraine, to the arms to be provided to Ukraine, and other aspects of assistance that can be done to my country. I don't believe at all that the Russian president requires any pretext for escalation of the war. And therefore, it is needed that Ukraine gets what it needs on the battleground to win. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you so much.